A short, haunting audio clip is all that remains of Timothy Treadwell's final minutes in 2003. It compresses a whole story into a few seconds, and those seconds force us to listen differently to what happened in the Katmai wilderness. Sound brings you closer than any still photo. Without clear video for every moment, the noises, a voice, a rustle, the cadence of footsteps, become evidence that investigators and friends use to reconstruct the sequence and timing of events. This recording is more than a thriller. It's a human moment caught in the open. Hearing the uneven breath or an abrupt silence makes the risk and the choices feel immediate, and that emotional pull changes how we weigh Treadwell's decisions and the role the bears played. You'll get a careful listen, concrete timestamp cues, and context that links those small sounds to bigger questions about wilderness, responsibility, and how we remember someone who lived at the edge. By the end, the clip won't just be noise, it will be a clearer piece of the story. 1. In October 2003, naturalist Timothy Treadwell and Amy Huguenard were camped in Katmai National Park, Alaska. The wind off the coast, they can make a lone tent feel like an island, and silence gets thick enough to hear your own breath. In October 2003, Timothy Treadwell and Amy Huguenard were camped in Katmai National Park, Alaska, out in that wide, bear-filled country. They had chosen a remote spot where brown bears came through to feed, which is exactly the kind of place Treadwell sought. The remoteness made everything feel immediate and private, but it also meant they were living inside the animals' daily routes. Treadwell had spent many seasons in Alaska, and that experience shaped how he lived in the field. Because he had grown used to the rhythms of bear activity and the way they used shorelines and river mouths, he set up camp in places other people might avoid. His familiarity led him to accept close encounters as part of life there, and that acceptance changed small choices: how gear was arranged, how long he stayed out after dark, what paths he took when moving between tent and water. Amy Huguenard was with him at that campsite and shared the same tent and routines. Her presence mattered. Two people moving, talking, and filming can create more noise and more moments of exposure than one person alone. Because they were a pair, tasks like cooking, packing, and carrying camera equipment were often done together, and those routines influenced how and when they interacted with nearby bears. Shared habits turned into shared vulnerability whenever a bear came close. Late-season conditions in Katmai also set the scene in practical ways. Bears concentrate on rich food sources like salmon runs as they prepare for hibernation, so campers near rivers and estuaries face more frequent encounters. Because October is near the end of the feeding season, animals can be especially focused and less tolerant of surprises. That shift in animal behavior has a direct effect on human activity. The closer the camp is to feeding areas, the higher the chance of a sudden, dangerous meeting. Being camped in that part of Katmai meant help was far away. The nearest ranger or rescue could be hours off across rough terrain or water. That distance shaped how they planned their days and their sense of safety. The isolation added pressure to every choice they made at the campsite, and in a place where brown bears roam freely, every small decision about where to pitch a tent or leave a pack has real consequences. 2. A camera was running, but the lens was covered, leaving only an audio record of events. Inside the shelter, what survives is sound. The recording device had power and a working microphone, so the only direct, time-stamped evidence of the last moments is acoustic: the shuffle of canvas, the crunch of underbrush, voices overlapping with animal noises. Because the lens was blocked, every visual cue that might have settled questions is absent, and that absence makes the audio itself the central piece of factual material to examine. You can trace a sequence by listening closely. A twig snaps, then a low growl or distant rustling, then a human voice that rises and fragments. Short intervals separate events and mark cause and effect. Forensic analysts use those gaps, matching the timing of sounds to plausible actions. A rustle suggests movement toward the tent. A sudden, sharp inhale often precedes a shout. A change in amplitude can indicate proximity. Concrete sounds, a zipper, a footstep on gravel, a hand slapping canvas, anchor the timeline in specific actions even without pictures. The microphone's placement and quality shape everything that's heard. A MIC inside a tent muffles some frequencies and emphasizes others, so breathing and fabric noise become prominent while distant animal vocalizations lose definition. Wind and terrain alter sound propagation too. Open tundra carries noise differently than a dense forest, and that affects how easy it is to localize sources. As a result, what seems like a nearby growl on the tape might actually be several yards away, and what sounds simultaneous can in reality be separated by seconds. Audio gives immediacy but also ambiguity, and that forces careful interpretation. Spectrograms, waveform analysis, and cross-referencing with known sounds help reduce uncertainty, but they never replace a visual record. Because of that, every definite claim has to be tied to what a particular sound can reliably indicate. A tearing fabric denotes contact, a human cry signals distress, an approaching heavy tread implies size and weight. The tape therefore becomes both evidence and question, clear on certain actions yet silent on motives and exact motion. 3. After the pair disappeared, the campsite was found and the recording was recovered by authorities. Silence felt wrong at the edge of that campsite, like someone had paused the world and forgotten to hit play again. Rangers found a tent cut open and gear strewn about, and among the scattered possessions they found camera equipment and an audio recorder that Treadwell had used to document his time there. Because the devices survived the scene, investigators were able to take the original media into evidence and start a careful review. The physical recovery of the recorder turned what had been only a missing person case into a piece of material proof that could be examined in a lab. Holding the little recorder raised the tension in the investigation, since a single tape can change everything. Park Service personnel catalogued the items, labelled them, and maintained a strict chain of custody so the contents would be admissible and preserved. For example, investigators documented who handled the media and when, and photographic logs showed where the camera and recorder were found in relation to the tent. That careful procedure mattered because the recording contained audible material that could corroborate the scene, voices, ambient wildlife sounds, and abrupt noises, and because the public interest in the case made every detail legally sensitive. Listening to what survived on tape produced decisions that had to balance truth and privacy. Analysts and the coroner reviewed the audio alongside physical evidence from the site to build a coherent account of events. The sounds on the recording were used to support the conclusion investigators reached about what happened. Filmmakers and journalists sought access later, but access was limited because the recording was treated as sensitive evidence and because it included distressing material. A well-known director who worked with the footage declined to include the attack audio in his film, citing ethical reasons, which shows how recovery of the recording influenced not only the investigation but how the story was told afterward. Recovering the recorder left a wake of procedural and emotional consequences for everyone involved. Because the recording existed and was recoverable, officials had to decide who would be allowed to hear it, how it would be preserved, and how to respond to requests for release. Those decisions shaped public understanding and controlled the flow of potentially traumatic details. The tape remained under official control, examined by investigators and kept from general release, and that constrained access created its own kind of closure, or frustration, depending on who was asking. 4. Director Werner Herzog listened to the tape while making Grizzly Man and chose not to include it. Curiosity about what actually happened in a moment of crisis is hard to silence. Herzog did listen to the recordings that investigators had recovered while he was assembling material for his film, and when he heard the final audio, he made a deliberate choice not to put it in the movie. He weighed the pull of shocking immediacy against the risk of turning a private, violent ending into public spectacle. Because he judged the tape would reduce the people involved to a lurid moment, he left it out. It's easy to imagine the tape as definitive proof, but Herzog chose other ways to tell the story. He used the extensive video diaries that Treadwell shot over many seasons, interviews with people who knew him, and his own narration to shape the narrative instead of dropping in the raw attack audio. That choice changed the viewer's experience substantially. By excluding the last-minute recording, Herzog kept the film's focus on behavior, character, and context rather than on a sensational soundbite. There was also an ethical logic behind the move. Having listened to those final moments, Herzog said later that he would not exploit the dead for cinematic effect, and that informed his editorial decisions. The consequence was practical. He avoided releasing material that could re-traumatize friends and family or be consumed as morbid entertainment. For example, rather than playing the attack audio, the film shows silence, reaction shots, and reflective commentary to convey loss without reproducing the violence. That absence shaped public debate after the film came out. People who wanted the grisly specifics had to make do with second-hand accounts and Herzog's framing, and others praised the restraint as respectful. The decision also left the recordings themselves off the public record, so discussions about the final minutes remained based on descriptions and the surviving footage, not on an audible replay of the attack. In effect, Herzog's listening led him to refuse amplification. and that refusal redirected how audiences understood the entire story. 5. The audio was never released publicly and remains known as a withheld piece of investigative material. There's an obvious silence where clarity should be. The raw audio from those final moments was never made public and sits in investigative files. Investigators gathered recordings as part of their work, and those tapes were treated as evidence rather than material for release. Because it's evidence, agencies set rules about who can listen and when, and those rules kept the recording out of the public eye. That silence has practical reasons behind it. Officials commonly withhold recordings to preserve the integrity of an investigation and to protect the privacy of the deceased and their loved ones. For example, agencies often delay or deny public release of 911 calls until next of kin have been notified, and the same logic applies here. Releasing graphic or destabilizing audio can interfere with legal processes and prompt copycat behavior, so police and prosecutors weigh the consequences before making any material public. Because the recording wasn't released, researchers, journalists, and filmmakers have had to rely on other sources to reconstruct events. Witness statements, camera footage that was published in edited form, and official summaries fill the gap left by the withheld audio. That lack of direct sound has fed speculation and competing narratives among the public, since people tend to fill in missing details with rumor when primary evidence is unavailable. The recording status also raises questions about access and ethics that aren't easy to resolve. As long as it remains part of a case file, access is limited to authorized investigators, certain legal representatives, and sometimes family members, and decisions about wider release hinge on legal, ethical, and technical factors. Agencies must balance the public interest in transparency against the right to dignity for the person recorded, and the practical need to keep evidence uncontaminated while the record is preserved. There's a tightness when the tape goes quiet. The recording captures Timothy Treadwell's last minutes in 2003, breathing close to the MIC, distant snaps of branches, a voice that sounds both alive and alarmed, details that make the moment feel immediate and raw. Forensic listeners have pointed to patterns in the audio and timing of sounds that suggest a sudden, violent encounter, and that evidence is what sparked much of the debate about how the material should be handled and why it was released. You probably felt something watching and listening. Maybe you leaned forward when a twig cracked or found your jaw clenching at the pauses. Those small, concrete sounds pull the imagination in and make the human cost impossible to ignore. That reaction matters, because the same curiosity that drives us to listen also raises hard questions about consent, privacy, and the line between documentation and intrusion. There's a knot when private moments become public. Family members, park staff, and researchers reacted differently, some asking for restraint, others arguing the recording sheds light on their behavior and on Treadwell's choices. So the tape didn't just end a life, it changed how people talk about wildlife conservation and media ethics. Concrete outcomes followed: intensified discussion among scientists about bear-human encounters, renewed attention on safety protocols in national parks, and ongoing controversy about what should be shared with the public. If you're left with questions about what the sounds really mean or about the people involved, you're not alone. We'll be releasing follow-up pieces that unpack the forensic analysis in detail. Sit down with a park ranger who knew the area and talk to a bioacoustics expert about how the sounds are interpreted. You might subscribe or follow to catch those conversations, and the source notes we'll make available in the episode description, so the next steps are clear and based on the evidence we can show. Sound is fragile. We'll keep listening.